We are continuing a series that we started a few weeks ago on Nehemiah. And today's topic is building through opposition. And my opposition this morning is this cough I've got. So y'all just ready for me and I make it through and we're going to be all right. I was just telling Miss Garnett, I feel like for the past few summers, it feels like I get some kind of upper respiratory something, and it's just so frustrating. But we're going to be all right. Now, when we first started in Nehemiah, we talked about how God laid it on Nehemiah's heart to do something for the Jews who had returned from exile and were living in the area called Judea. And he answered God's call. He was determined to go, even though it was going to cost him something. And then on Father's Day, we talked about the fact that when he finally made it there, he already had a plan before he even asked the king to go. He did not go into this with no idea of what he was doing. He had counted the cost. And he had even examined the walls of the city before he approached the people in Judea with the plan, because he knew he needed to see it for himself. And we talked about how God often calls us to do something. We have to be the catalyst that shakes people out of complacency in our homes, in our workplaces, in our churches, because we're all called to build something. We're all called to be planners. But with today's passage, we have officially arrived in Jerusalem. Nehemiah has shared his plan to help rebuild the walls of Jerusalem with all of the officials and the priests and the nobles, and they all said, yes, let's do it. They are on board. They want to build the wall. What seems impossible has now become possible because God said so. And Nehemiah and the other officials were willing to say yes to what God called them to build. So, in chapter 3 of Nehemiah, and I'm just going to kind of gloss over this because we're going to get to Nehemiah 4 today. Nehemiah 3 is actually a very long list of a whole bunch of people. Because what happened is when Nehemiah presented this plan to everyone, and they said, let's do it. Let's rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Let's provide protection for our city. It's going to take a lot of people. They couldn't do this alone. So we actually know that the wall around Jerusalem at this time was either between 2 miles to 2.5 miles all the way around. I don't know about you, but that is a large section of brick wall, stone wall, to work on repairing. Now, some places were in better shape, but some were very, very rough. We know in our other passage, when Nehemiah tried to ride around on his horse, there were places his horse couldn't even get through. This was going to be a big job. And so what happened when he sent out the call to say, we need to work on this together? We have 41 groups and families of people who answered the call and said, we will come help build what God has called us to build. And so they come and they leave their towns and their villages. Some of these people didn't even live in Jerusalem. And they came and they left their farms and their fields and their shops behind. And they all came together to work on this wall. And they did not have jackhammers and they didn't have cranes. This was going to be hard, exhausting, heavy work. And yet they still came because they saw what was good about this work that they were going to undertake. They had a common goal, but they were willing to put their time and energy into it. Now, Nehemiah assigned different sections of wall to different families. We see anybody and everybody work on this wall. This wasn't just a project for the nobility. It wasn't just a project for those who were low-born. We see the priest were assigned a section to work on. The people from Jericho had their own section to work on. The people from a little town called Tekoa, a town 8 miles away, they came and they camped out in Jerusalem and they had a section of wall. And in fact, they completed 2 sections of wall for Jerusalem because they were so enthusiastic about the project. There was a goldsmith, there were perfumers, there was one guy, he didn't even have any sons, but he brought his daughters and put them to work too, and they all worked on the walls together. The people from Zanoah, another little town, came and they built a gate, and then they worked on a section of wall 1,500 feet long, just that one group by themselves. Each leader in Jerusalem had their own section with their families. There were priests from other towns who came and served. There were temple servants who built on the wall. There were merchants who built on the wall. Anybody and everybody who answered the call came together to build a wall that had felt impossible to build. Don't you love it when we see people come together for a common goal? Remember when we had the floods in eastern Kentucky a couple years ago? And everybody, you look at the rubble that some of these floods leave behind, and you go, where do you start cleaning this up? This feels impossible, right? There's no way we could do this. But then we see people come from all over the nation. And what did they do? They came in and they put their hands to work and they moved rubble and debris out of the way, and people's homes were rebuilt. The same thing when Hurricane Helene came through in the Appalachians. You saw other people from eastern Kentucky who had endured floods themselves. What did they do? They said, we are coming to help because we know what it is like. How awesome is that? Doesn't that just make everybody feel good, even in the midst of disaster, when you see something like that happen? And so in this passage, we have this inspiring, beautiful account of all these people from all over the nation coming together to rebuild a wall. No matter their differences, no matter their financial situations, the wealthy were working alongside those who were lower class. It did not matter. They were going to complete this project as a community. And it's beautiful. And a couple weeks ago, we've got homecoming coming up, and I was reading through Brother Chambers' account that he gave about the start of Epperson. And I found this little gem of a section. You see, Brother Chambers had been here for 3 years, preaching out of the old schoolhouse that's set here on this property, when he says, on Saturday, July 9th, 1939, the school board put the school property up for sale in front of the courthouse, and I was there to bid it in. Lester Berger and Sarah Thacker run the price up to $300 when my bid for $310 secured the property for the church. Monday morning, July 11th, Evelyn Moreland and Dealey Moore went to Winchester and canvassed the town, going from store to store, raising money to pay for the old schoolhouse. They came home with enough to make full payment and to buy us an organ. Preachers, we were really delighted. We were on our way. But some preachers tried to discourage us, saying there wasn't enough people in the community to make a church possible. Y'all, they didn't even have enough money to pay for the amount. They didn't have money in the bank to pay for the property when they bid on it. But God provided, didn't He? And even though they had a calling from God to put this into place here at Epperson, there were naysayers who said, it's impossible for this to succeed. Isn't that crazy? That of all things, people wanting to worship and love God in this community, and there were people saying, there's just not enough people there to make it possible. But y'all, it did. It was possible, because what happened? They came up with enough money and they built a new building, and then they eventually added on bathrooms, which was a great addition, wasn't it, Miss Garnett, I think? And then they built a parsonage. And then we have a new fellowship hall. We have continued to expand and grow over the years. And we are 90 years out from when this property was first bought by Epperson. And what they said was impossible to succeed has succeeded far more than people ever anticipated. And y'all, but here's the thing. Epperson faced some opposition back then too. Did y'all know that? Right after the property was bought, there was a lawsuit brought against the church. Mr. Berger put a barbed wire fence around the property and brought a lawsuit for the building claiming it was his. The schoolhouse that was here was originally built in 1867 near where Mr. Bob Epperson lived, hence the name. But in order to get the schoolhouse away from his house, he exchanged locations with the school board, but there was never any deed made for the exchange of property. So the county had possession of this property for 72 years. And then he said, wait a minute, we still have a deed for this property. And he tried to claim it as his after the church had already bought it. Now, was the church trying to do anything or make anybody mad? No, they were just trying to simply exist, right? And here came trouble. But guess what? The lawsuit was decided in Epperson's favor. So let's jump back to our people in Judea and the story of Nehemiah. What are they doing? They're just trying to rebuild a wall, right? In Jerusalem. They've come from all over the country to build something, to make something. Epperson did that on a much smaller scale, but this was a bigger scale back in the day. And you would think they're not trying to bother anybody. But they still faced opposition. So we're going to read about this passage in Nehemiah 4, starting in verse 1, about what happened once they decided to start at work on this wall and everybody had come to town. And you see, it says in verse 4:1, Sanballat was very angry when he learned that we were rebuilding the wall. He flew into a rage and mocked the Jews, saying in front of his friends and the Samaritan army officers, "What does this bunch of poor, feeble Jews think they're doing? Do they think they can build the wall in a single day just by offering a few sacrifices? Do they actually think they can make something of stones from a rubbish heap and charred ones at that?" And Tobiah the Ammonite, who was standing beside him, said, "That stone wall would collapse even if a fox walked across the top of it." Wait a minute, we've got two guys who are sitting here watching them rebuild a wall. They're not trying to harm anybody. They're just doing what they feel is in the best interest of their community. And already you've got people who are angry and mocking them for their attempts to do something that God has called them to do. So we actually meet Sanballat and Tobiah in chapter 2, right after Nehemiah arrived in town. Verse 10 says, "But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite official heard about my arrival, they were displeased. Someone had come to help the people of Israel." And then right after Nehemiah said, "Hey, this is what we're going to do. We're going to build a wall." It says, "When Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem the Arab heard about our plan, they scoffed contemptuously. 'What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king?' And I replied, 'The God of heaven will help us succeed. We, his servants, will start rebuilding this wall, but you have no share, no legal right, or historic claim in Jerusalem.'" So who in the world are these guys who are causing all this trouble for the Israelites? And they're over here trying to do something God's asked them to do. Sanballat was the governor of Samaria. Samaria is right north of where we were in Israel at the time. And then it's interesting because his sons actually had Jewish sounding names. So, and the Samaritans were kind of this group that kind of believed in God. They had been moved into the area by the Assyrians, and they had adopted some of the beliefs about God, but they also mixed their beliefs with some idol worship. But they should have been excited and encouraged by their neighbors doing well, right? Because if your neighbors are doing well, that means better for you. And then next door across the Jordan, we have Tobiah the Ammonite. And Tobiah is actually a Jewish name. And again, his sons were named Jewish names. So if he loved God, surely he would have been happy for the Jews to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. But he wasn't. And then just south, we have Geshem the Arab, who was the governor of that area. So now we have the Israelites surrounded by 3 governors who were all mocking them and making fun of them for attempting to build what God has called them to rebuild. They're not trying to bother anybody, and yet they still face opposition. Y'all, my point with this is God calls us to do things. But why are we surprised when we run into problems trying to do what God's called us to do? There's always going to be opposition to God's plans. Because we do have someone who does not want the kingdom of God to succeed. We do have an enemy who wants to deter us from the plans that God has for us. Why are we surprised when we run into opposition by doing what God has called us to do? Sometimes we think, if God's called us to it, surely He's going to make a way through it. That's what, have y'all heard that phrase? God's called you to it. He's going to make a way through it. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. It doesn't mean it's going to be not fraught with trials and problems. And we have this group of Jews who are trying to rebuild this wall. And there's already opposition that they don't even deserve. And yet they're going to have to deal with it anyway. So often we want to make changes in our lives, don't we? And sometimes, has anybody ever tried to pay off debt? And then every time you make some progress, something breaks. And then you're like, I'm just starting over from the very beginning. And it feels like every time I turn around, like I'm just spinning my wheels and there's no progress being made. Or if you've tried to get healthy and make some changes in your personal health journey, and then you get sick and you break an ankle or something like that. And it feels like every time I try, something happens. Have y'all ever had that experience? Oh, I'm going to do better and get my education, or I'm going to get a better job. And then something happens and you keep getting a wall. And it feels like, God, I feel like this is what I'm supposed to be doing. But every time I turn around, there's a roadblock. And it's so frustrating. Here's the thing with our story today. We ought to expect, if God has called us to it, we should expect opposition in it. We should not be taken by surprise when the enemy doesn't want us to succeed. It shouldn't throw us off guard. So what in the world did they do in this situation? So that's what we're going to talk about for the rest of chapter 4. And so let's read this together. And Nehemiah said, "Then I prayed, 'Hear us, our God, for we are being mocked. May their scoffing fall back on their own heads, and may they themselves become captives in a foreign land. Do not ignore their guilt. Do not blot out their sins, for they have provoked you to anger here in front of the builders.' And at last the wall was completed to half its height around the entire city, for the people had worked with enthusiasm. But when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabs, Ammonites, and Ashdodites heard the work was going ahead and the gaps in the wall of Jerusalem were being repaired, they were furious. They all made plans to come and fight against Jerusalem and throw us into confusion. But we prayed to our God and guarded the city day and night to protect ourselves. Then the people of Judah began to complain. 'The workers are getting tired and there's so much rubble to be moved. We will never be able to build this wall by ourselves. Meanwhile, our enemies were saying, before they even know what's happening, we were going to swoop down on them and kill them and end their work. The Jews who lived near the enemy came and told us again and again, they're going to come from all directions and attack us. So I placed armed guards behind the lowest parts of the wall in the exposed areas. I stationed the people to stand guard by their families, armed with swords, spears, and bows. Then, as I looked over the situation, I called together all the nobles and the rest of the people and said to them, don't be afraid of the enemy. Remember the Lord who is great and glorious, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. And when our enemies heard that we knew about their plans and that God had frustrated them, we all returned to our work on the wall. But from then on, only half my men worked, while the other half stood guard with spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. The leaders stationed themselves behind the people of Judah who were building the wall, and the laborers carried on their work with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. And all the builders had a sword belted to their side, and the trumpeter stayed with me to sound the alarm. Then I explained to the nobles and officials and all the people, the work is spread out, and we are widely separated from each other along the wall. But when you hear the blast of the trumpet, rush to wherever you hear it, and our God will fight for us. So we worked early and late from sunrise to sunset, and half the men were always on guard. And I told everyone living outside the walls to stay in Jerusalem. That way they and their servants could help with guard duty at night and work during the day. And during this time, none of us, not I or my relatives or my servants or the guards who were with me, ever took off our clothes. We carried our weapons with us at all times, even when we went for water. Wow. There's a battle plan here for how to deal with opposition. So let's walk through this. First, when Nehemiah heard about their plans, he prayed about it, and it wasn't a cute prayer. It was, let them see what it feels like to be in our position. They don't understand. See what they're doing, and let them see what it feels like. Not all prayers need to be nice. Sometimes we need to pray for our enemies, but when we're under attack, when people don't understand our calling from God, sometimes you can ask God to help them back off. That's okay too. But as we see in this passage, even as they continued to build after they prayed about it, it made their enemies even angrier and angrier. And they still faced opposition. The more successful they were in doing what God called them to do, the more opposition they felt like there was. And y'all, that is so true. Sometimes in our personal life, sometimes even as a church, that the more successful that we are in doing what God's called us to do, the more obvious it's going to feel like there are problems that keep popping up and turning around. And we go, what in the world is happening? And our whole passage today is telling us we are not surprised by any of the opposition that we feel like is occurring. And we are going to keep moving forward and keep building because we are trusting that God is going to thwart the enemy's plans. So you see, the Jews who were living in this area were the underdogs. They were the group of people. They were not wealthy financially. They didn't have large numbers. They did not have a successful kingdom anymore. Nobody expected them to be able to fight back. And yet, because God was with them and God had called them to build something, they were able to be successful. But how did they approach this plan of attack? So there's 5 things that we're going to talk about that this passage shows us that they did to help thwart the enemy. Okay? So 5 things. And it's funny because when I was doing this is not how I planned it, and they all start with a P. So how about that? So 5 P words. The first thing that they did was they had to be perceptive. Did they stick their heads in the sand and ignore what was going on around them? Or did they have their ears open to listen to the potential problems and the rumors that were starting around them? They were perceptive. They were aware of the little things that they were hearing about Tobiah and Sanballat and what they were saying. And they took these reports seriously, and they didn't ignore them. God sometimes calls us to certain tasks, and sometimes we need to consider the ramifications, the potential problems that exist with whatever God's called us to. If you have ever been called to do something that you don't necessarily understand, God sometimes asks us to step out in faith. And we don't know the hows or the whys or how it's all going to work out. But that doesn't mean we can't think through it first, right? When I first started staying at home and didn't go back to looking for a teaching job, we didn't know how that was going to work out. Had no clue because, there were loans to be paid for my education. And God worked it out anyway for his good. I didn't know all the answers, but we did consider all the potential problems. So, part of having a good battle plan and meeting opposition head on is to think about what in the world the problems could be that we're facing. And facing as a church, facing if you're thinking about switching a job, or thinking about what happens if you want to, say, if you're an addict and you're trying to get out of your active addiction, you're going to have to face the problems that you could encounter when you come home, right? A lot of addicts have to do that. What does it look like when I have to find new friends? You have to think through those things. So part of being what God's called us to be is to be perceptive of the potential problems around us. And then the second thing that they continued to do faithfully was pray. They said, we are the underdogs. We know we are not well equipped. We know that we are not a great army. We don't have a lot of power or influence. God, you're going to have to take care of this for us. They acknowledged the problem they had, and then they had to give some of it away and say, we can only do so much. We need your favor. We need your protection. How often do we encounter a problem and then we think, let me see how I can figure this out first, and then if I can't figure it out, I'll take it to God. We tend to do that sometimes, don't we? We say, this is a minor issue. I can figure it out. Say if the car breaks down, you're looking at calling AAA and you're doing all the things that you know to do. But it's okay to go to God first and foremost before you even attempted to try to do all the things that there are to do. And so the next thing they did was they continually prayed about how to deal with this situation, because surely that wasn't going to be able to handle it by themselves. And then the third thing they did was they planned. They said, okay, we know that we've got trouble coming. There's potentially a big problem. We've prayed about it, but now we have to give to God what we can give to God, but we also got to do what we can do for ourselves. We're not going to sit back and just trust God to do it all by himself. We're going to work with God to do what we can do to mitigate this issue. And so, in this case, what did they do? They stationed guards everywhere. They armed everybody. They said, nobody is going to be by themselves. You have to have a weapon. We are going to have a guy with a trumpet, and if you hear the trumpet sound, we need everybody to come running. They had a game plan that they sat there and they had this conversation. Somebody's going to be on guard at all times. We're never going to leave anybody alone working on a section of wall by themselves. We are a community and we're a group, and they produced a plan to help deal with the potential attack from these neighbors. We are all supposed to be part of this church community that works together to spread the gospel, to tell people about Jesus. And it's not always easy work. Sometimes it's very difficult work, especially where we live now in a climate where more and more people are skeptical of what we believe. And when we are making headway, when we're building something for the Lord, we should expect the opposition. The enemy knows exactly where we're the most vulnerable and tends to attack in those spots. And it's our duty as a community, when one of us is attacked, to run to each other and say, you are not alone in this. We're going to gather around you and we are going to help protect you. Right? Y'all, I have had some conversations with some other pastors in the past few months. And one of the things that has been apparent to me over the past few months is that we have had our own version of some opposition in the past few months. And it feels like there's just sometimes one thing after another. And I look at some of our board members and the things that they've experienced in their personal lives. And I go, this is not coincidence that one after another just seems to get hit with thing after thing after thing. And on a level, I tell people, I say, I know that there is a level of spiritual attack here, because if Epperson truly gathers together and is what Epperson can be, we're a dangerous, dangerous force for the kingdom of God. Y'all, we shouldn't be surprised when Epperson itself is under attack at times, because the enemy does not want us to be successful. So how do we plan to rally around each other, to build each other up, to come to each other's aid? Sometimes it's a phone call, sometimes it's a visit, but do not neglect coming together as a community. Sometimes we may feel an attack on a personal front, and we talked about that. Sometimes it feels like you're spinning on your wheels when you're trying to get out of debt or make good health decisions. That's when you need a community too. Even if you've got something going on a personal level, part of being the church means that we share those burdens with one another and we lift each other up, and we don't try to do this by ourselves. Because when one person is hurting, we should all be hurting. We should all be gathering around them to help build them up. And I do not think it's coincidence sometimes, the amount of things that we go through, the amount of hurt and trouble and turmoil that we experience in our lives. Because the more and more turmoil that we undergo, the more of a distraction it is from what God has called us to build. And as we see in this passage, Tobiah and Sanballat over and over again tried to distract and deter the Israelites from doing what God called them to do. And time again, they refused to be distracted. They refused to quit. They refused to give up, and they kept on building. And part of that, the next P, was they remembered their purpose for what they were building. So Nehemiah called them to remember why they were building the wall. For them, it was for the safety of all the future generations, for their children and for their wives and their brothers and their daughters. And he said, this is the best thing for our community because it's going to make you safer, because, back in them time, walls were really important. When we are building something for God, sometimes when it's really hard, it's important that we remember why we're building it in the first place. As a mother, how many mothers have had a sleepless night when you go, oh my gosh, why did I choose to have children? Okay. Oh, sometimes we've had those moments. Sometimes you've had a moment when you're like, why did I choose this job? Why did I choose this career? Because this is ridiculous. Whatever I'm dealing with. But there is a reason God puts you wherever it is, however hard it may be. And we have to continually remember what God is calling us to build. And so for us, on a personal level, it could be calling you felt called to be healthy and to get your personal health and fitness in order. For some people, it's getting out of debt, or it's switching careers, or it's gaining a higher education. For some people, they're having to relearn some habits that they learned as a child growing up that were not healthy, and they're having to put those to a side, but there's a reason God's called us to anything that He's called us to. If it's a job's change, if it's getting out of debt, if it's moving to a place that maybe you weren't sure about moving to, there's always a purpose and a reason, and we have to remember what that is. I know as a church sometimes it's easy to get into a rut and a routine, and you just come and you show up and you do, the normal things, and then you leave and you go home. But the purpose of the church was never just to come and sit and be entertained. The purpose of the church was to be part of the kingdom of God, to lift each other up, to teach each other, to share what your burdens with one another, and to spread the gospel to other people. And when it's difficult, we have to dig in and remember what we were here for in the first place. And then our last P that I want to tell you about is they took precautions. So not only did they plan what to do in face of opposition, they actually carried it out. It's easy to make plans all day long and put it on paper. It's a lot harder to actually see it out and do it, isn't it? Who's ever made a list of things to do for the summer that you were going to tackle, all those home projects, and they don't necessarily get done? Or you've made a plan to get fit, and you were going to do this on Mondays and this on Wednesdays, and it was going to be great, and then first thing that happens, that falls off the rails real quick. Y'all know how New Year's resolutions work. It's not enough just to plan it and say you're going to do it. They actually had to carry it out. They had to take the proper precautions. They were diligent in looking and watching over each other and keeping the enemy away. And in fact, it's so interesting because they actually planned and they prayed and they took all these precautions and they remembered their purpose and they were re-energized. Guess what happened? They were never attacked. So they had been threatened. The opposition said, we're going to come kill them all. But when they looked and they took the precautions, because they were aware of the potential trouble and they armed themselves and they got their defense on, the enemy decided, actually, they're not worth attacking anymore because we're not really sure about this anymore, because they realized that who was with them the whole time? God was. And so in Nehemiah 6, we read that Sanballat and Tobiah, since they couldn't scare the people into stopping, they actually tried to lure Nehemiah away from Jerusalem to kill him. And 4 times they tried to do this, and he refused to be deterred, and he stayed right where he was. He was not dissuaded. And in the end of Nehemiah 6, it says, so on October 2nd, the wall was finished. Y'all know how many days it took them to rebuild the whole wall of Jerusalem? 52 days. Can y'all think about that? Would y'all think that they were capable of rebuilding a wall 2 miles around the whole city of Jerusalem in 52 days? Does that sound impossible? It absolutely sounds impossible to me. But when our enemies and the surrounding nations heard about it, they were frightened and humiliated. They realized that this work had been done with the help of our God. So despite all this opposition they faced, that they did not deserve, that they didn't do anything to instigate others doing what God had called them to do, because they remained faithful, because they took precautions, because they didn't stick their head in the sand, because they prayed to God for help, they did what seemed impossible in 52 days. Y'all, there's no crane, there's no nothing, that seems crazy to me. The fact that that could have been remotely possible, that they could have done that. And because they continued on and did what God called them to do, their enemies were made fools. They were humiliated. They had no power there anymore, did they? All because they continued to build and work, and they didn't give up. So, my call to you today, hopefully, is if God has called you to do something, do not be surprised when you encounter problems and trials and opposition. Because if God's called you to it, yes, He will see you through it, but somebody else doesn't want you to be successful. So do not be surprised when you face opposition. But when you are aware that there is opposition, then we are going to look around. We are going to be aware. We are going to go to God in prayer. We are going to make a plan. We are going to remember our purpose for what God has called us to. And we're going to put precautions in place to mitigate what the enemy is planning. And when we do that, we know that we can be successful to keep on building whatever God has called us to. So some people in this room, they are facing trial after trial, and it seems like there's this never-ending line of things and troubles that keep coming their way. And you're worn down and you're frustrated. Be encouraged, because you are not alone. You're not the first person to ever encounter problem after problem, and it feels like it's never going to end. But God is always with us. He will always fight for us. He just asks us to keep building what He's called us to build. And so that goes for Epperson too. We cannot stop being who we've been called to be as a church. We cannot stop telling people about the good news of Jesus. We cannot stop inviting people to church. We can't stop doing the things that we've been doing, right? We're going to continue on. We're going to keep building. We are going to be a light to others. There is opposition, but that does not mean we're defeated.